Hey guys, how's it going? Today we're going to be looking at section 12.4 part 1. Um, and as you guys will see as I go through this, I've already kind of filled in the things that I'm going to be talking about, so please fill it in with me. I had made the video and then my program crashed, and so I'm now making it again. So here we go. So we're looking at volumes of prisms today, and part 2 we'll be doing volumes of cylinders. So for the volume of a prism, the volume formulas tend to be quite a bit simpler than surface area. So we already really got through the hard part of this chapter. We're just going to be looking at the volume stuff at this point. And so what you're going to see today, the one formula we're going to deal with is the volume of a prism, which is simply the area of the base times the height. And so as you look at this, the one thing to keep in mind, and we would have already talked about this earlier in the chapter, but when we look at a prism, when we talk about the base of a prism, remember the two things that have to be your bases of a prism have to be shapes that are both parallel and congruent. So as I look at this first prism that I see right here, you actually have a couple choices on this one. So take, for example, the left side. If you see this rectangle right here, that is parallel and congruent to the right side. So those could be your two bases. You could also use the bottom rectangle and the top rectangle as your two bases, because those guys are the same size and they're parallel. And so for this one, you actually have some choices. I wanted to show you, you could do it either way and still get the same answer. So here was their setup that they did over here. So they started out by doing the area of the base, and they were calling the bottom as the base. So the 7x3 rectangle that you guys see right here, they were calling that the base. And so if you were to do it that way, we would say, well, what's the area of that rectangle? If we did 7 times 3, I get the area of the base. And then if I multiply that by my height, which would be this guy right here, it's going to look like this. So here's the area of the base times the height, and we would get 84. And so if you look at that as our volume, that would totally work just fine. If you were to say, well, I want to use the right side and the left side as my two bases, that would be fine too. Because if I did the area of the base, which would be 3 times 4, and then I multiply that by the height, which would then be 7, my setup would look like this, and I still get 84. So either way, we're going to get the correct volume. Just two different approaches to it. The one thing I want you guys to keep in mind is, how do we identify the height of a prism? The height is whatever connects your two bases together. So if I'm going to use the right side and the left side as my two bases, then 7 would be my height because that's what connects those two bases together. Right, and so we get this setup right here. And guys, as you do these today, I would encourage you to do your work the exact same way that I am. Always start with a formula, show what numbers are getting plugged into that formula, and then get your answer. Right, and so they're going to be looking like this. Let me go through a couple examples with you. And like I said, these are already filled in. That wasn't my intention, but I kind of lost my first video when I was filling this out. So just fill this in with me. So as you guys look at this guy right here, we have another prism. Now this one is a little unique because all of the sides are the same. So we do call this a cube if all the sides are the same. It's also a prism also. But either way we look at it, we're going to say, let's find the area of the base, multiply it by the height. And so as I look at this, we can see that the base on this is a square. So I'm just going to find the area of the square, which is length times width, or base times height. So 8 times 8 is going to give me the area of that base. And then I'm going to multiply it by my height, which I see right here is also 8. And so there would be our setup. And if we just multiply those together, we have our volume. So pretty simple on that one. Take a look at this prism right here. You're going to see this throughout multiple shapes that we do. Whenever you get a prism, or this could be any shape, but whenever you get one that looks like it's leaning to the side like this one is, we call that an oblique shape. So in this case, we're talking about an oblique prism. There's no different than just doing any prism. I'm still going to find the area of my base, which you can see right here. We could use the rectangle on bottom, which would be 7 times 4. So I'm going to find the area of my base, and then I'm going to multiply it by my height, which they're telling me right here is 3. One thing to always keep in mind is your height does have to be perpendicular to the base, which is why they drew it this way. And you can see they noted that it is perpendicular. But otherwise, it's a pretty direct shot into our formula. So area of the base times the height. Here is one that I really want you to guys focus on, because, let me adjust my camera for a sec. Because this is one that, if we mess it up, this is one that tends to get confused quite a bit. So as I look at this, I'm still going to do the area of the base times my height, but what's confusing is, what's your base? Like, what do we call the base on this? So often, people want to say, well, this rectangle right here on bottom is my base. Can't be, though, because there is not another rectangle that is parallel to that one. And so that cannot act as our base. Instead, if you see the triangle right here and the triangle right here, those have to be our two bases, because those are the only two shapes within this diagram that are both parallel to each other and congruent to each other. And so those are going to be our two bases. So we're still going to take the approach of, let's find the area of the base, which is going to be this, times the height of the prism, which we'll identify in just a second. So when I started out by saying, well, let's just do the area of the base. Okay, well, if our base is a triangle, I'm going to do 1/2 base times height to get the area of that triangle. On this one, they told us that this was 12, that hypotenuse right there. So that means this hypotenuse is also 12. And so you can see by this angle, we're going to solve a 30, 60, 90 triangle. If my hypotenuse is 12, we know to divide it by 2 to get the short leg. So that's where he came from. And if I take my short leg and multiply it by the square root of 3, we get the long leg. Right? And so there's all the numbers that I'm going to need for this. So when I start by just doing the area of the triangle, we're going to do 1/2 base times height, and this is my base, and this is my height. And we know we can use those as base and height because they are perpendicular to each other. So here's what it would look like if I plug those in. I got the base of 6 radical 3. It's got a height of 6. And so just this setup right here is going to be the area of our base, the area of that triangle. Then we got to multiply it by the height of the prism, which, remember, how do we define the height of the prism? The height is whatever connects your two bases together. So this 15 right here is what connects those two triangles, and so that 15 is going to be the height of our prism. Guys, if you really take the approach of just laying out the formulas and then just identifying the parts and plugging in the numbers for those parts, it's a really safe approach, and you'll have a lot more success this chapter if you do it that way. When I multiply these together, if I just leave the square root of 3 as the square root of 3, then I can write it in radical form like this. So the 270 was where I just did 1/2 times 6 times 6 times 15. We'll get you this number. And then I had the radical 3. I just left it as radical 3. So if you were ever asked to leave your answer in radical form, this is what it would look like. If we were asked to type it into our calculator and write it as a decimal to the nearest tenth, that's what this would look like. Guys, be careful on your rounding. Let me show you, at least on this one. If I put in 270 radical 3, it's going to look like this. Don't write that as 467.6. Right? Stick with your rounding rules. The next number is a 5, which pushes your 6 up to a 7 if we round that to the nearest tenth. Okay, and so this is the way it needs to be written to be the proper answer. But then that would be our volume. Guys, I also want you to keep in mind when we talk about volume, the difference in volume versus surface area is volume measures what's on the inside of the shape, whereas surface area measures what's on the surface, what's on the outside of the shape. And so that's kind of the difference in our answers in this section compared to what we've done earlier this chapter. All right, one last one. Again, I have another prism. In this case, we got to identify what our base is. And remember, in order to have a base, you got to have another shape that is both parallel and congruent to that one. So some might look at this and say, well, let's use the rectangle on bottom as our base. Again, that can't be the base because the rectangle on top, even though it's parallel, is not the same size, right? They're not congruent. So those cannot be our bases. Our bases would be the two trapezoids that you see as kind of like the front and the back of this diagram. So I darkened one of them, so just to kind of help make it a little more clear as to where our bases are at. So we're going to have to find the area of the base, the area of the trapezoid, and then multiply it by the height of the prism, which would have to be this one because this is what connects our two bases together. So let's start out by just finding the area of the base. So here's the area of the trapezoid, which is our base, and we're just going to plug our values into that. So as you look at the trapezoid, this guy would be the height of the trapezoid, 1.5. So that's going in for h. That's this guy. And then I have to add the two bases together of that trapezoid. So as you look at your trapezoid, I have a base right here of 2. I got another base right here of 4. So those are going in as my two bases. And that's this part. That's going to be the area of the trapezoid, our base. We're going to multiply that by the height of the prism, which is 6, because that's what connects your two trapezoids together. And if you just do a straight shot into your calculator and multiply all that together, should be exactly 27. So try that. Make sure you guys are doing this part too in your calculator just for practice. Want to make sure that you're putting everything in there correctly so it comes out looking like this. As you guys do your assignment today, again, I really encourage you guys to write it out the same way that I am, because this is how I want you to do it on your quiz and tests when you get to those. So it's a really safe approach. You're not trying to do too much in your head or in your calculator. Show that work and write that stuff out so that you're going to be more accurate with your answers. But that is it for part 1.